Nobody noticed the man in the last row. He sat alone, uninvited, perfectly still. The kind of still that comes from waiting a very long time for something you know is about to happen. 200 guests filled the church around him. No one looked his way. No one thought to ask who he was or why he was there. They were all watching the altar. Elizabeth stood at the front of that church in an ivory dress, holding a bouquet that had started to tremble in her hands. The ceremony had not begun. The music had stopped. And the man she was supposed to marry was no longer looking at her. He was looking at the second row. Then Parker said Shawna's name, softly, almost gently, like he was doing Elizabeth a favor. And Shawna, her cousin, her closest friend, Jeannie, the woman who had helped choose that dress, stood up from her pew and walked toward him without a single moment of hesitation. The church went completely silent. 200 people watched it happen. 200 people sat perfectly still. Not one of them moved to help her. Not one of them said a word. Elizabeth did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that showing pain only gave people something to enjoy. She was still standing there, bouquet raised, face unreadable, when she heard a sound from the back of the room. A chair scraping against stone. Slow, deliberate footsteps beginning to move. A man was standing up. And the moment the people near him saw his face, 3 of them leaned away without even realizing they had done it. His name moved through the church like a current. Bade Faulkner. And he was walking straight toward her. He walked like the aisle belonged to him. Not fast, not angry, just steady and unhurried, the way a man moves when he has already decided how something is going to end. The guests closest to the center turned their heads as he passed. A few whispered to each other. Most simply went quiet, the way people do when something is happening that they do not quite understand but can feel. Elizabeth watched him come. She had not moved. She was still standing exactly where Parker had left her, in the same spot, holding the same flowers, as if her body had not yet received the message that the wedding was over. Around her, the church buzzed with the low, stunned murmur of 200 people who had just watched something they would be talking about for years. A woman near the front was crying. Someone had knocked over a program. Shawna was standing beside Parker now, her hand resting in the curve of his arm, her eyes carefully not looking at the altar. Elizabeth noticed all of it. She let herself notice none of it. The man in black reached the altar and stopped. He was taller up close, broad through the shoulders. There were a few threads of gray at his temples that made him look not older, but more certain. The way some people simply grow into authority, while others spend their whole lives reaching for it. His eyes moved over her face once, quickly, the way you check someone for damage after something breaks. Then he spoke. 4 words, low and direct, meant only for her. You do not have to stay. He extended his hand. Elizabeth looked at it for a moment. She did not know this man. She had no reason to trust him. She had no idea why he was here, or what he wanted, or what would happen if she took what he was offering. All she knew was that behind her stood the ruins of a life she had spent 3 years building, and in front of her stood the only person in this building who had bothered to stand up. She placed her hand in his. His grip was firm and steady, and he did not say anything else. He simply turned and began walking, and she walked beside him, down the aisle, past the rows of guests who parted slightly as they moved, the way water shifts around something that is not asking for permission, past her aunt, who had pressed a handkerchief to her mouth, past Parker's side of the family, who watched with the particular discomfort of people witnessing consequences they did not expect. Past the fourth row, where a man in a dark gray suit sat very still with a leather portfolio balanced across his knees. Bade paused at that row. He leaned down slightly and said something to the man in the gray suit. His voice was too quiet for Elizabeth to catch even a syllable of it. Whatever it was took no more than 5 seconds. When he straightened and began walking again, Elizabeth glanced back. The man in the gray suit had gone the color of old chalk. His hand was flat against the portfolio like he needed something to hold on to. She did not know who he was. She filed the image away and kept walking. The church doors opened. The afternoon light came in sharp and clean, and then they were outside, and the sound of the crowd fell behind them like something closing, and Elizabeth breathed for what felt like the first time in an hour. And a black car was waiting at the bottom of the steps. A driver held the door without a word. She got in. Bade got in beside her. The door closed with a soft, definitive click. The car began to move, and the church, and Parker, and Shawna, and the ivory dress that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else entirely, all slipped away behind the tinted glass. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Elizabeth looked at her hands in her lap. They had stopped trembling, which surprised her. She felt strangely calm, the hollow, floating calm that comes right after something enormous has happened, and your mind has not yet caught up to what it means. Then she asked, "Why did you come?" Bade was looking out the window. The city moved past them in long gray streaks of glass and concrete and afternoon shadow. So he was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Because I knew what Parker was going to do before he did it." Elizabeth turned to look at him. How? He did not look back at her. His jaw was set. His hands were resting on his knees, perfectly still. "Because I have been watching Parker for 2 years. A pause. Just long enough for what he had said to settle. "And you for 4. The car moved through a green light. A pedestrian crossed somewhere to the left. The city carried on exactly as it always did, entirely indifferent to the fact that Elizabeth's understanding of the last 4 years of her life had just shifted beneath her like ground before an earthquake. She did not speak again. She simply sat with what he had said, turning it over in the silence, trying to find the shape of it. 4 years. And he had been watching her for 4 years, which meant he had been watching before Parker, before the engagement, before any of it. The question was not who he was anymore. The question was what he had seen. The estate appeared at the end of a long private road lined with old oak trees, their branches meeting overhead in a canopy so dense that the afternoon light came through in pieces. Elizabeth watched it through the window as the car slowed. The building was enormous and quietly certain of itself. Dark stone, tall windows, ivy climbing one entire wall with the patience of something that had been growing there for a century and intended to grow there for another. No one had told her where they were going. She had not asked. The car stopped. A woman was already waiting at the front door, older, with silver hair and a calm, unhurried expression that suggested she had spent decades managing things that would have overwhelmed most people. She introduced herself as Michelle. She did not seem surprised to see Elizabeth. She did not seem surprised by anything at all. Michelle showed her to a room on the second floor. Elizabeth stepped inside and stopped. The room was beautiful. That was the first thing. High ceilings, tall windows overlooking the back gardens, afternoon light falling across a pale wooden floor in long, warm rectangles. A sitting area near the window, a wardrobe along the far wall, a small bookshelf beside the bed, its shelves already filled. It was the bookshelf that made her go still. She crossed the room slowly and looked at the spines. The collected letters of someone she had read in university and mentioned to no one in years. A novel she had bought twice because she kept wearing out her copies. A book of landscape photography she had stood in a shop doorway reading for 20 minutes once, on a Tuesday afternoon, alone. She had never bought it. She had told herself she would go back. She never did. It was on the shelf. Elizabeth turned. She opened the wardrobe. Clothing filled it. Dresses, blouses, coats, everything folded and hung in colors she would have chosen herself. She checked the size on the nearest hanger. Correct. She went to the bathroom. The toiletries on the shelf were the exact brand she used. The exact scent. Not a close approximation. The same ones. She stood in the center of the room for a moment. Then she went back downstairs. Bod was in the sitting room off the main hall, jacket removed. Standing near the window with a glass of water he had not touched. He turned when she came in. He read her expression and did not pretend not to understand it. That room was not prepared for a guest, she said. No, he said. It was not. She held his gaze. I want to know how. He set the glass down. He told her. 4 years ago, a financial conference downtown. She had been there representing her firm. He had been there for his own reasons. They had not been introduced, had not spoken, had not exchanged so much as a glance as far as she had known. But halfway through the afternoon, a client presentation had fallen apart. A technical failure, last minute, the kind of thing that sends rooms into low-grade panic. Elizabeth had stepped in. She had held the room together with nothing but composure and 2 minutes of clear thinking. And afterward, everyone had moved on as if it had always been fine. Bod had not moved on. He had asked someone her name. He had followed her career from a distance after that, in the same way he followed anything that struck him as exceptional, quietly and with patience. When she became engaged, he had asked Michelle to run a background review on Parker. Standard practice, he said. Something he did when anyone he paid attention to made a significant decision. What Michelle found was not what he expected. He placed a file on the low table between them. It was thick, bound with a simple clip, the edges worn from handling. He did not open it. He just let it sit there. Parker had been moving her money, not stealing exactly. Nothing so obvious. Redirecting. Small account changes here, a shared structure there. Joint frameworks built quietly over 3 years that would make it nearly impossible, in the event of a separation, to determine what had been hers to begin with. He had not been building a life with her. He had been building a legal argument. Elizabeth looked at the file. She did not touch it yet. Bade then told her what he was offering. Not a rescue. A formal arrangement. A marriage on paper, documented and structured, that would give her legal standing to challenge every account reclassification Parker had engineered. Michelle had already prepared the necessary filings. She could refuse. If she refused, Michelle would proceed with the case regardless. The offer was separate from the help. It was simply a choice he was putting in front of her, because he thought she deserved to have one. Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment. "How did you know about the hand cream?" she asked. Bade said nothing. He looked at a point slightly past her shoulder, just briefly, just long enough to answer without answering. She did not push it. She picked up the file and took it upstairs. She sat on the edge of the bed and opened it. Her name was on the first page. Her accounts. Her savings from 6 years of careful, deliberate work. All of it mapped and redirected like water being quietly rerouted away from its source while she was looking somewhere else. She turned to the last page. There was a date at the top. She read it. Then she read it again. 11 days. Parker had begun this 11 days after they first met, before he had ever reached for her hand, before he had ever said her name the way people say names when they mean something by it. She closed the file. She set it on the nightstand. She lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling while the room grew slowly dark around her. 11 days. Which meant the question was no longer what Parker had taken. The question was what else he had planned from the very beginning. The days that followed were quiet in a way Elizabeth had not expected. Not uncomfortable, not strained, just careful, the way two people are careful when they are both paying close attention, and neither of them is willing to say so out loud. She found the library on the second morning, a long room with floor-to-ceiling shelves and two leather chairs angled toward the window, and she settled into it the way she settled into everything, without asking, without announcing herself, as if she had simply decided it was hers. Bade found her there that afternoon. He sat in the other chair. He picked up a book. An hour passed before either of them said a word. When they did start talking, they argued. Not badly, not with any real heat. But Bade had opinions, strongly held and precisely expressed, and Elizabeth had long ago stopped suppressing hers around men who seemed certain they were right. She pushed back on something he said about risk and consequence, and he went quiet in a way that she realized, after a moment, was not displeasure. It was attention. He was actually listening. She was not accustomed to that. Dinners stretched long past the plates being cleared. Evenings in the garden became a quiet habit, the two of them walking the stone path that wound between the rose beds while the light faded out of the sky in long bands of orange and purple. On one of those walks, their hands drifted close enough that the backs of their fingers almost touched. Bade went still for just a second. Then he moved his hand away. She noticed. She did not say anything. But that night, lying in the dark of the prepared room with the file still on the nightstand, she admitted something to herself that she had not been ready to admit before. She would have minded if he hadn't pulled back. She would have minded quite a lot. Then, on the 5th day, a car came up the long, oak-lined road. Elizabeth was at the sitting room window when it arrived. A woman stepped out, tall, impeccably dressed, moving with the particular confidence of someone who has never once second-guessed their right to be somewhere. She had a beautiful face and the kind of easy smile that suggested she had spent her whole life being received warmly, and fully expected this to continue. She greeted the staff at the door by name. She touched Bade's arm when she laughed at something he said. A light, familiar touch, the kind that carries history in it. Elizabeth watched from the window for exactly as long as it took her to understand what she was looking at. Then she went upstairs and did not come back down. She told herself it did not matter. She had no claim here. She was a guest in a room full of books chosen for her, wearing clothes in exactly her colors, drinking tea from the brand she had never mentioned to anyone. But still, a guest. She sat in the chair by the window and watched the garden go dark, and told herself, again, that it did not matter. An hour later, there was a soft knock at the door. Michelle entered with a tray, tea, a small plate of food, everything arranged with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything. She set it on the table by the chair. She left without saying a word about the woman downstairs, or why Elizabeth had not come to dinner, or any of the things that were sitting in the room between them. She simply turned to go. There was a small square of paper folded beneath the teacup. Elizabeth saw it after the door had closed. She unfolded it. 6 words, written in a hand that was precise and unhurried. She is nothing. The chair was empty. Elizabeth sat with it in her hands for a long moment. She read it 3 times. The third time, something in her chest loosened, just slightly, like a knot coming undone at one end. She was still holding the note when her phone rang. The name on the screen was Shawna. Elizabeth looked at it for 3 full rings. Then she answered. The voice that came through was careful, soft, rehearsed in a way that sounded like it wasn't. Shawna did not apologize. She had clearly decided apologizing was not the shape of this conversation. Instead, she explained, gently, in the tone of someone delivering news they believe is necessary, that Parker had not been truly happy. She said it the way people say things they have been practicing, with sorrow and sincerity and just enough vagueness to make it impossible to argue with. She said that some things simply could not be forced, that some connections ran deeper than others, that surely Elizabeth, of all people, would understand that holding on to something that wasn't working would only have made everyone miserable in the end. She said, surely you must have felt it. She said these things kindly. That was what made it so devastating, because the implication beneath all of it, soft and careful and never spoken directly, was that the failure had always been Elizabeth's, not the betrayal, not the theft, not the 18 months of lies. The failure, the insufficiency, the simple, quiet fact of not being enough to make a man want to stay. Elizabeth said almost nothing. She said, "I see," once, near the end. Then the call finished and the phone went silent in her hand. She sat very still for a long time. The note was still on the table beside the cup. And then, because she was Elizabeth, because she had always processed pain by looking directly at it rather than away, she opened her laptop. She typed Shawna's name, then Parker's. Then she hit search. The first result was a photograph, a charity event across town, the caption said. She recognized the venue. She knew the date it was held. Shawna was laughing. Parker was leaning toward her. They were not touching, but they were standing in the particular way of 2 people who have already decided they will be. Elizabeth looked at the date beneath the photograph. 14 months ago. 8 months before Parker had taken her to dinner and told her he wanted to spend his life with her. 8 months before he had slid a ring across the table and smiled the smile of a man who meant it. It had never been an accident. Not one day of it. She closed the laptop. She picked up the note again, the 6 words she had already memorized, and held it in both hands in the dark. 14 months. The question was no longer whether Parker had planned the wedding. The question was what else he had built, and how deep it went, and whether she had already seen all of it. She was beginning to suspect she had not. The note was on the nightstand when she woke up. She had put it there before she slept, deliberately, face up, the 6 words visible from the pillow. She was not sure what that said about her. She decided not to examine it too closely. She was still looking at it when Michelle knocked and entered with a small envelope on a tray. Not tea this time, just the envelope, plain white, with Elizabeth's name written on the front in handwriting she did not recognize. Inside was a legal document. 4 pages, dense with language designed to obscure what it was actually saying. Elizabeth read it once quickly, then set it down and read it again slowly. It was a filing. Parker's attorney, the man in the gray suit from the church, she understood now, had reclassified every account she had held before she ever met Parker as a commingled asset, citing joint household expenditures and shared financial activity across the course of their relationship. 3 years of ordinary living, groceries, a shared streaming account, 1 weekend trip where she had used her card because his was declined, reframed, carefully and deliberately, as evidence of a financial partnership. Her savings, her investment account, 6 years of work, before Parker had ever existed in her life, now legally described as something they had built together. She set the document down on the bed. She sat with it for exactly as long as it took her to understand that this was not a reaction to the wedding falling apart. This had been prepared in advance. This had been waiting. Then she stood up. You picked up the filing and went downstairs. Bade's study was at the far end of the ground floor, a room she had not entered before. The door was half open. She knocked once and pushed it the rest of the way. He was at the desk, reading something, jacket on despite the hour. He looked up when she came in. He took in her face and the paper in her hand, and he did not say anything. He simply waited. She placed the filing on the desk in front of him. "I am not here to ask for help," she said. Her voice was steady. Her hands were not. "I am here to tell you that I want to fight, not just to get back what he took." She looked at him directly. "I want Parker and Shawna to understand exactly what this cost them. I want them to feel the weight of every decision they made from the beginning. I want it to be real for them. Not just inconvenient, real." She stopped. The room was very quiet. Bade held her gaze for a long moment. Then he reached down and opened the desk drawer. He placed a file on the desk beside her filing. It was thick, 2 inches, maybe more, bound shut with a heavy clip, the pages inside slightly uneven from handling. He did not open it. He slid it toward her. She opened it herself. The first section was bank transfers, dozens of them, small amounts, spread across 31 months, each one moving money in a direction it should not have gone. The second section was account documentation, the original structures Parker had set up, with annotations in Michelle's handwriting marking each change, each reclassification, each quietly moved decimal point. The third section was witness statements, 2 former colleagues of Parker's, a junior associate from his firm, a building manager who had been asked to alter a lease document and had declined and then written it down. And then a forensic accounting report, 60 pages, which traced Parker's financial strategy with the patience and precision of someone who had known exactly where to look. It went back to the very beginning of their relationship. It went back, in fact, to 11 days in. Everything Lopez had filed that morning had already been answered, countered, superseded. Michelle had been building this case for 2 years, quietly, methodically, in exactly the same way Parker had been building his. Elizabeth turned the last page of the forensic report. There was one more page behind it, separated from the rest, with a small yellow marker. She almost missed it. She unfolded it. It was a printed communication, and an email chain between Parker and his attorney, dated 6 weeks before the wedding. She read the subject line. Then she read the body. Then she sat down in the chair across from the desk because her legs had made a decision her mind had not yet caught up with. The email discussed a contingency plan. Specifically, the plan for what would happen if Elizabeth discovered the account reclassifications before the wedding took place. The wedding, the email explained with careful legal language, was the threshold. Once Elizabeth said her vows, the asset structures became significantly harder to challenge. The priority was ensuring the ceremony was completed. And if it was not, if she found out, if she ran, if something went wrong, the fallback strategy was the public exit. A scandal at the altar, witnessed by 200 people. That would frame Elizabeth as unstable and discredited, and therefore unlikely to be taken seriously by any court that reviewed her claims afterward. He had not left her for Shawna. He had used Shawna to destroy her credibility, on his schedule, in front of his chosen audience, because it was the cleaner outcome of two options he had prepared months in advance. Elizabeth set the page down on the desk. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at Bade. He was watching her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not pity, not satisfaction. Something quieter than either of those. Something that looked like it had been waiting a long time to be allowed out. She said, "Marry me." He went completely still. She said it again, and this time her voice did not waver at all. Not the arrangement, not the protection. "I am choosing you, right now, because I want to." He looked at her like she had said something in a language he had stopped expecting to hear. She held his gaze. He said, "You are certain?" She said, "Yes." Then she picked up the flagged page again and looked at it once more and asked the question that had been forming since she unfolded it. "How long have you known about this page?" Bade did not look away. "From the beginning," he said. She breathed slowly. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" A pause. "Not long, just long enough to be honest." "Because I needed you to be angry for the right reasons," he said quietly, "not his." The study was very still. Outside the window, the oak-lined road was dark, and the gala was 4 days away, and Parker and Shawna were somewhere on the other side of the city, completely certain that Elizabeth had gone quietly. She set the page back inside the file and closed it. They had 4 days to be certain of that. She intended to use every one of them. Parker had been working the room for 20 minutes by the time the doors opened. He was good at it. He always had been, moving from group to group with an easy hand on a shoulder here, a laugh at exactly the right moment there, the particular warmth of a man who understood that perception was its own kind of currency. He had told people that Elizabeth had not taken the ending well, that it had been painful for everyone involved, naturally, but that he wished her nothing but the best. He had said it with enough sorrow and enough dignity that most people had accepted the version without question, because no other version existed yet to compete with it. Shawna stood beside him in a green dress, her hand resting in the crook of his arm. She looked composed and a little brittle, the way people look when they are working harder than they are letting on. She smiled when she was supposed to smile. She laughed when Parker laughed. Then the doors at the far end of the room opened and the host's voice carried clearly across the hum of the crowd. "Mr. and Mrs. Faulkner." The room did not go silent all at once. It went quiet the way a tide goes out, gradually, completely, and then all at once you notice the shore. Heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Glasses paused halfway to mouths. Elizabeth walked in on Bade's arm in deep burgundy silk, her posture unhurried, her expression entirely calm. The Faulkner ring caught the light at her left hand, a stone that half the people in this room recognized on sight, because Bade Faulkner was not a man whose family jewelry went unnoticed. The name, the ring, and the expression on her face arrived as 3 separate pieces of information that the room assembled into one conclusion in the space of about 4 seconds. Parker saw her. Something moved across his face, not quite surprise, because some part of him had probably known this was a possibility, but the specific, cold recognition of a man watching a plan fail in real time. Shawna's hand tightened on his arm before she had fully registered why. Bade guided Elizabeth forward with the ease of a man walking through a room that had always belonged to him. He steered her on a path that was not accidental. It brought them, without hurry, directly to where Parker and Shawna were standing. He stopped. He smiled. It was a perfectly constructed smile, warm, entirely without malice, the most dangerous kind. "Parker," he said, "congratulations on the Harlan merger. I heard it closed last week." Parker opened his mouth. Bade continued without pause. "I have to thank you, actually." He tilted his head slightly, as though something had just occurred to him. "Your clarity of intention at the wedding moved several of my own plans along considerably faster than I had anticipated." He said it in the tone of one professional complimenting another on an unexpected efficiency. Parker said nothing. Bade glanced briefly toward his left and smiled at Shawna with exactly the same pleasantness, and then looked back. "My legal team has finalized the asset recovery proceedings. By the way, he said it the way you mentioned that the weather is expected to clear. We look forward to resolving it quickly." He touched Elizabeth's hand where it rested on his arm. "I know my wife will be glad to have it behind her." The word wife landed with the quiet, particular weight of something that had been chosen with great care and placed precisely. 3 tables away, Lopez set down his champagne glass. He did not pick it up again. Shawna opened her mouth. Something was clearly trying to assemble itself into words. Elizabeth turned and looked out at her. Just looked. Not with anger, not with coldness, but with the composed and level gaze of a woman who had decided not to leave any more space in this conversation than was strictly necessary. Shawna closed her mouth. Then Bade turned them both toward the dance floor. And they moved away, and behind them the room slowly, visibly shifted. It happened without announcement. 3 people who had been standing with Parker a moment ago found reasons to drift elsewhere. The host crossed the room toward Elizabeth and Bade with the particular warmth people reserve for those whose goodwill they would like to keep. By the time the orchestra moved into its second set, Parker and Shawna were standing in a room full of people who had simply stopped looking at them. They were not humiliated. They were not confronted. They were not destroyed. They were just no longer relevant. That was worse. That was so much worse. Months passed. The legal case settled. Every account was returned. Lopez withdrew his representation in a letter that was 2 sentences long and said nothing. Parker and Shawna left for a smaller city where the name Faulkner did not carry the same weight, which was most of what they had been hoping for. On a morning in early spring, Elizabeth stood in the garden as the sun came up, both hands wrapped around a coffee mug, watching the first roses of the season open along the stone path. The air smelled like damp earth and something green and beginning. She had been standing there long enough that her feet were cold, and she did not care at all. She heard the door behind her. Bade crossed the garden in shirt sleeves, no jacket, his hair not yet arranged, carrying a second cup. He stopped beside her. He did not say good morning. He just stood there, looking at the same roses she was looking at, close enough that his arm was warm against hers. She said, "I thought I wanted revenge." He waited. I thought that was what this was all about." She looked at the roses. "But I think what I actually wanted was to stop disappearing." He turned to look at her. "Did it work?" he asked. She turned toward him. "Ask me again in 40 years." He took one of the coffees gently from her hands, and they stood together in the garden. While the light came up and the roses opened and the morning arranged itself into something neither of them felt the need to describe. Somewhere on the other side of the city, in the apartment Parker and Shawna now shared, there was a chair at the kitchen table that had never felt right. The wrong height, the wrong angle, an inexplicable discomfort no matter where it was placed or how many times it had been moved. Parker had tried it in 4 different positions. He could not figure out why it never sat correctly, so he never would. Elizabeth had not disappeared. She had simply stopped leaving room for people who had stopped deserving it. And it turned out, once you stopped doing that, there was so much more space for everything else.